Welcome, and thank you very much for coming to Effective Altruism Melbourne's Q&A with Professor Peter Singer on the philosophy behind effective altruism. We're really delighted to have Professor Singer with us today because he's one of the most central figures in the effective altruism movement. My name is Vanessa Tompkins, and I'm the president of Effective Altruism Melbourne. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Burrawong people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Just a couple of quick things about housekeeping. There are exits on both sides of the theatre at the front and also at the back. And if you're looking for the bathroom, there's a bathroom right outside the main doors of the theatre here. You can also head down the corridor and turn left, and there are more bathrooms there. Also, if you could all just check to make sure you've got your mobile phones turned off so we don't have any disruptions during the event, that would be great. Thank you. If you're not already familiar, effective altruism is a philosophy, a research field, and a social movement of people trying to use high-quality evidence and careful reasoning to do as much good as they can. It's also a community of people taking seriously the question of how we can help others the most and focusing their efforts on the most promising solutions to the world's most pressing problems. So you'll hear much more detail about that from Professor Singer in a moment. Effective Altruism Melbourne is a local group of people interested. Effective Altruism Melbourne is a local group for people interested in effective altruism. We try to promote high-quality discussion about effective altruism and spread knowledge about effective altruism by engaging in outreach activities and running multiple high-impact events per month. I'll share some more details about upcoming events at the end of the night. So, tonight we'll begin with an introduction to effective altruism from Professor Singer. This will be followed by an interview of Professor Singer on some of the key philosophical criticisms of effective altruism. After this, Professor Singer will answer some of your questions about effective altruism. So please submit your questions at any time throughout the night using this URL here. You can also find this URL on the Facebook and Meetup events, so it might be easier to access from there. After the Q&A concludes, I'll be back to wrap up, and then there'll be refreshments in the foyer, so please do join us for those. It's now my pleasure to introduce James Fodor. James is the previous president of Effective Altruism Melbourne and is the current leader of the EAGX Australia Conference Organising Committee for 2018. He's also a prolific writer and podcaster on topics ranging from history and science to religion and philosophy. He'll be interviewing Professor Singer tonight, so please join me in welcoming James.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. It's a privilege to be here this evening and to see you all. So thanks a lot for coming. So as Vanessa said, this evening we're going to be focusing on philosophical criticisms of effective altruism. And before we start, I just want to explain sort of why we're focusing on that theme. There's a couple of reasons, and one is that we feel as a social movement it's very important that we avoid being sort of stuck in an echo chamber where we all just sort of say what we agree with and agree with each other and nod and feel smart together. It's important that we challenge ourselves and think about potential objections and what people who disagree with us have to say. So we want to focus on that a little bit tonight. Also, we want to try and improve effective altruism, right? We don't want to assume that we're already doing everything perfectly and that there's nothing we can learn from our detractors. So that's the spirit in which we are coming here tonight. So it's important to realise that we're not trying to give like a fully balanced view of effective altruism this evening. Professor Singer will give a brief introduction to start us off, but for the most part we're going to be focusing on objections and criticisms. So that's just what to bear in mind when you're sort of evaluating what you're going to hear. So as Vanessa said, in a moment Professor Singer will be giving a brief introduction for effective altruism, and after that we'll move into the questions. So we'll start off with some pre-prepared questions, and then over the course of the discussion we'll sort of move into questions submitted by you guys to the URL there. Now you can submit questions at any time, starting from now, and we'll get to those, or I'll get to those over the course of the evening. When you're submitting questions, just remember that we're focusing on philosophically based questions. So I guess there's potentially a wide range of other questions or criticisms of EA that you could potentially formulate, but we're going to focus on the philosophically related ones tonight. So I mean, it's a bit ambiguous as to what counts as a philosophical question, but hopefully you can think about that yourselves. Okay, so Professor Singer needs no introduction from me, but I'm going to give you mine anyways. So Peter Singer is one of the world's leading moral philosophers and founder of the effective altruism movement. He's Professor of Bioethics in the University Centre for Human Values at Princeton University, and also Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne. He's the author of the seminal 1972 essay, Famine, Affluence and Morality, and as well as two recent books that make the case for effective giving, The Life You Can Save and The Most Good You Can Do. Additionally, he's written or edited over 40 books on topics ranging from altruism, bioethics, animal liberation, and the environment. As mentioned before, he's also the co-author of The Life You Can Save, a non-profit organisation which is named after his 2009 book, which is devoted to encouraging people to give more and to give more effectively to help fight global poverty. Please join me in welcoming Peter Singer.
Thanks very much for that introduction, James, and thank you and Vanessa and all the others involved in putting this event together. It's great to see a full theatre on a rather wet night, so it's nice that you turned out and are interested in this. I'm told that probably some of you know quite a lot about effective altruism, but that some of you may know very little. So this introduction is aimed at those of you who know very little, and I will apologise in advance for boring those of you who already know everything that I'm likely to say. But we will then, as James said, get into these deeper waters for the rest of you. So I think Vanessa already said that effective altruism is a social movement, a philosophy, and a field of research. In terms of, let's start with philosophy. It's a philosophy in the broad popular sense of the term, not in the more narrow academic sense of the term, which we could say as ultimate values by which you live. And so the ultimate values by which you live are, firstly, that altruism is a significant part of your life. It's not that to be an effective altruist, everything you do has to be altruistic. Otherwise, I think we'd have a very small organisation of a few saints. There's not too many of them around. But we are realistic, and yet we think that humans have the capacity to act altruistically, and many of us do act altruistically quite a bit of the time. We're trying to encourage more people to make altruism one of your important life goals, and to think about that as an important aspect of your life, one of your values, something that you find worth doing for its own sake and rewarding as well. So that's the altruism part. What's the effective part? Well, one way of thinking about that, perhaps, would be to compare the way many people think about doing good, which might be things like donating to charities, or it might be volunteering your time. Compare the way people think about that with the way you think about other things on which you expend resources. Let's just think of the resources for the moment as money. So, of course, we're spending money all the time. And think about what we do when we want to spend it. Suppose, for example, that unfortunately your laptop has died and you need a new one. So you will probably do some asking around as to what's a good laptop to get, what's one that gives you value for money. You might go online and look at various advisory sites that tell you that, or you might just shop around. And then you would make a purchase. And if you came back with a laptop and a friend said, "Oh, why did you buy that one? It's notorious for breaking down, or it costs twice as much as an equivalently good laptop," you'd probably feel a little foolish. But if, on the other hand, you give money to a charity, you probably don't do any research into how good that charity is. Well, maybe the fact that you've come to this meeting suggests that you're more likely than most to do research, but most of the studies suggest that only about 20% of people who give to charity do any research on the charity that they're donating to. And if they do, it's generally pretty perfunctory. It might be, for example, like looking at the percentage of revenue that goes on administration as compared to programs. But really, that isn't what you want to know, presumably, when you give to a charity. What you really want to know is that your donation is going to do good, and preferably, certainly if you're an effective altruist, you want it to do the most good that you could get. So just as with buying a laptop, if somebody told you, "Oh, you could have saved the lives of twice as many children by donating to a different organisation, and the same similar children, similar circumstances, and so on, you would probably also think, well, maybe I didn't make the best choice, or whatever else it was that you were doing. Restored sight in twice as many blind people, for instance. You would probably think the same. But there are certainly that kind of difference, and in fact much larger differences. Differences not just of twice, but maybe of 100 times as much good that you can do by donating to one charity rather than another, or even more. And just looking at how much of the money goes on administration rather than programs isn't a very useful guide. In fact, the fact that many people do that really has put pressure on organisations to cut back their administrative expenses, which actually they may just do as an accountancy move. They may just relabel some funds, which doesn't mean very much, or they may do it actually by trimming their staff. But if they trim their staff of people that they need to ensure that the programs that they're putting the money into are actually working, then the results may be much worse than if they retained those staff. So they might, for example, have spent an extra 10% on administrative costs as compared to if they had a very lean staff. But because of that, 50% more of their programs are actually effective than were effective with the trimmed down staff. So obviously, they're doing more good per dollar now, even though they're spending more on administration. So what you really need to do is to find effective charity evaluators that look at the impact on the ground of what different organisations are doing. And that's been one of the important things that has got the effective altruism movement really going, that there are now such organisations that are doing serious evaluative work. So you don't have to do it all for yourself, which is just as well, because it can take hundreds of hours to evaluate a single organisation properly. But you can find all of that work being done. So that's essentially what the movement is about. It's a movement that is relatively new. It's only been going for about 10 years. As I say, it's pretty new to have these rigorous evaluative organisations on the ground. And it's also new to have people discussing effective altruism online and in meetings like this, and talking about which are the most effective organisations to donate to or to volunteer for. Also, effective altruists talk about what kind of careers you might choose if you're at the career choosing stage, or possibly the career changing stage, where you could do the most good, because again, that's something that a lot of people might think about in terms of choosing a career, but they might not really have very much of a clue as to which careers would be likely to do good in that way. So there is now this large worldwide movement that is looking at these questions, doing more research into them, putting more information online, and encouraging other people to do that. The movement is quite broad in its aims. I've given you examples like saving lives, and as James said, I co-founded an organisation called The Life You Can Save, and by the way, there is a Melbourne chapter of The Life You Can Save, and Chris Quinn will be outside afterwards at a table if you're interested in being involved in that. And The Life You Can Save is interested in helping people in extreme poverty in poorer countries of the world. That's its specific goal. And that's an important part of effective altruism, and it's the part that I was involved in, as James said, way back in the 1970s when I wrote Famine, Affluence and Morality, before there even was an effective altruist movement, or the term effective altruism wasn't even known. But effective altruism, as I'm sure will emerge when James and I sit down to talk, is much broader than that. Essentially, it's looking at ways of doing good that are effective, and although I think that helping people in extreme poverty is a highly effective way of doing good, there are certainly other candidates that are around, and we're going to be talking about that. So I think I've probably had my 10 minutes now, so I'll go back, and James will ask me some questions. Thanks very much.
All right, are we good with the sound? Can you hear me?
Yep, all good. Okay, excellent. So, let's get started then. We've got heaps of questions here. I'm sure we won't get through all of them, but we'll see what we can do. So, maybe start off with something sort of light and simple. Well, not really. So, the foundations of morality. So, I mean, a lot of people here will probably be fairly comfortable with the idea that we have moral obligations to help people or to do good, or at least that it's, you know, good for us to do things like that. But not everyone really agrees with that. So, there are some people who deny that there are any moral facts that are objective, and therefore we don't have any moral obligations to do anything in particular. And there are other people who hold to a view called ethical egoism, which holds that what is morally good for us is just to pursue our own self-interest. So what would you say to views like this?
Yeah, well, firstly, is this working?
Oh, turn it on.
Yeah, you got to turn it on, there's a little on switch.
Oh, that one, good. Thanks. Okay, so firstly, you sort of ran together the claim that there are no objective moral facts with the claim that we have no moral obligations. A lot of people would think that if there are no objective moral facts, then moral nihilism follows. But in fact, there are also a lot of philosophers who would reject that view, who would say, even though there are no objective moral facts, we have moral attitudes, which perhaps we're subjectivist, perhaps they're just my moral attitudes, perhaps they're of some group that I'm part of, maybe my society, maybe my culture, still no objective moral facts, but things that I share with other people in the culture. And we can therefore talk about moral obligations, we can talk about right and wrong, we can talk about good or bad, because when we do that, we're expressing these attitudes. We're expressing our own attitudes, or we're expressing attitudes of a larger group, depending on which particular view you have. So, many of these philosophers say we don't have to abandon moral language. We don't have to say, well, it doesn't matter what you do, or anything like that. So, effective altruism could certainly accept that there are no moral facts and try to encourage people to have attitudes that go along with the idea that we do have obligations to other people, that there are right and wrong ways of behaving to them, and that that's a basis for trying to do good. Now, I'm not sure whether on the basis of that answer you want me to go on and defend whether there are or not moral facts, or where you want to go from there?
No, not necessarily. But do you think that the existence of moral facts, or the moral realism, or something like that, do you think it's necessary for effective altruism as a community to defend that, or would that be a misfocus?
No, I don't think it's necessary to defend it. Some people will feel more comfortable with the idea that what they are doing is not just in accordance with their attitudes or with the attitudes of some larger group, but is sort of objectively true. And what we might mean by that was, so suppose there were people who had completely different attitudes from you, didn't share any of your personal attitudes or of the attitudes of your group, and they had a different view about what was right or wrong. Would there be any way of adjudicating between them? Would there be any way of saying, well, I'm right or my group is right and they're wrong, or conversely, they're right and now I realise that I'm wrong and my group is wrong? So you could think of it. You could think of it that way. But if you do think of it that way, I think you might say, well, even if there is no way of adjudicating between them, these are my attitudes, these are my views, and I'm going to act in accordance with them. Because that's what I want to do, that's what I support. And that doesn't mean, go back to your other part of your first question that I realise now I neglected to answer, that doesn't mean that you're an ethical egoist, right? You can have attitudes that are subjective in the sense that they're your attitudes, but are not only focused with your own well-being. Because, for example, you might just care about others. You might, for example, have watched in the last few months the footage of the live export trade, and sort of seen those sheep slowly dying from heat stress and exhaustion and not being properly had enough to drink and so on. And you might have thought, that's horrible, I don't want that to happen. And that is quite compatible with it being your subjective attitude, but you would still think, that's something that I want to stop. So the same with effective altruism then. You could think, okay, so I want to be altruistic towards those sheep, or I want to be altruistic towards people living in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world, and I want, not only do I want to do some good for them, but I want to do the most good that I can for them. And that's all that's necessary to be an effective altruist.
Right, so stepping down slightly from meta-ethics to ethical theory, so some people have criticised effective altruism for being too strongly wedded to consequentialism, especially utilitarianism. Maybe you can give a bit of an explanation for that for those who might not know. But the criticism is that, well, not everyone adheres to that moral theory. Some people are deontologists or virtue ethics or other things like that. Is there a place in EA for these people? And is some of the language that effective altruists use maybe exclusive of these sorts of views? What do you think about that?
Okay, well, I'll for those who are not familiar with the terms, I'll give you some quick definitions. A consequentialist is the view that the right act is the one that produces the best consequences of all the options open to you. And conversely, the wrong thing to do is something that doesn't produce the best consequences. Utilitarianism is a member of that species, if you like, or that genus, let's say, of consequentialism. It's the particular species in that genus that says, and by best consequences, we mean the acts that will do the most to promote the well-being of all of those affected. Well-being being a sort of general term for something like happiness or satisfaction of preferences or desires. They all count as different views about what is well-being. So that's what utilitarianism is. And then, so James' question is really saying, so is effective altruism only for people who accept these views that right or wrong depends on consequences or even on some more narrow version of what those consequences are, and not, for example, use the word deontological, a nice philosophical Greek word that essentially means that there are some things that are right or wrong irrespective of their consequences. Okay, whatever happens. Let justice be done even if the heavens fall, is a kind of deontological statement. So, to come now to answer your question, no, effective altruism is not only for consequentialists, let alone only being for utilitarians. It certainly is a broad enough tent to encompass deontologists of various kinds. For instance, suppose that in general you do think that it's good to do what will have good consequences, let's say to make people and animals perhaps happier, suffer less, and so on. That is generally good things to do. But there are some things that you think we ought never to do. You might, for example, think we ought never to kill an innocent human being. You might be moved by Dostoevsky's example in The Brothers Karamazov, where he asks, suppose that you could create kind of peace on earth forever, no more wars, no more suffering, but first you have to torture that little child over there. You might say, no, wouldn't do it, it would be wrong to do it. Okay, you're not a consequentialist now, because you said that. Is that really going to restrict what you can do as an effective altruist? Well, not unless someone brings you a child and convinces you that if you torture this child, there will be peace on earth forever. And I'm prepared to bet that that is not going to happen. Right? So that person is clearly a deontologist who can be as fully an effective altruist as any consequentialist. Now, you might have some more rules than that, ones that perhaps might have more practical applications. Some people, for example, believe that it's always wrong to tell a lie. That's, I think, still officially the position of the Roman Catholic Church, that to deliberately and intentionally tell a lie is always a sin. Now, that might restrict in the real world the amount of good you can do. But still, there would be lots of occasions where you could do good without telling a lie. And so you could still be an effective altruist too.
Yeah, so I think some of the most trenchant criticisms of the philosophy of effective altruism come from certain traditions which are more hostile to the idea of impartiality and a sort of broad abstract theories of ethics. So, for example, there's a perspective called ethics of care, for instance, which focuses on interpersonal relationships. And people like this think that morality is situated and constitutes sort of the interactions between specific people. And they kind of don't like the idea of focusing on like abstract calculations about what would do the most good, or what would generate the most utility, or even other approaches to that. Similarly, some people have said, consequentialism just treats people as identical receptacles for utility, and it doesn't consider their own uniqueness and their relationships to our individuality, preferences, and so on. So I don't know if you've encountered that sort of objection before, but do you have any thoughts on that sort of line?
Yes, certainly. I have encountered that objection quite a bit. So, in fact, one of the earliest books in the Ethics of Care was written by Nell Nonnings, and I remember reading that book and being a little bit surprised, I must admit, by some of the things she said. For example, I was already at that time a vegetarian and concerned about the ethics of how we treat animals. And she refers to that, and she says, well, if you're a farmer and you have a relationship with some of your cows, so you have a cow you call Bessie or Daisy or something like that, then you have obligations to that cow. But you don't have obligations to the anonymous animals in factory farms whose corpses you might be purchasing at the supermarket. So that's because you're not in any relationships with them. So your obligations are dependent on your relationships. And that just seems to me to be really far too narrow a view of what our obligations are, that they're limited to those who we're in particular relationships with. Which is not to say that, you might have some more moderate version, and I think probably most proponents of care ethics today would have more moderate versions, where they might say, well, you do have obligations to complete strangers, and possibly even to animals in factory farms, but you have stronger obligations to those you're in relationships with. And again, this is something that I think effective altruists can live with. They can, somebody might say, I said in my first remarks, we're not expecting people to be saints. We're not expecting people to think altruistically in everything you do. So if you would do more, even significantly more, for people that you're in close relationships with, your parents, your children, your significant other, whatever it might be, but you still leave some space for obligations to strangers based on where you can do the most good. Again, I think you can still be an effective altruist. So whether this ethic that you've described is one that is really in conflict, complete, diametrical opposition to effective altruism will depend on how extreme a form of an ethic of care it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one potential issue might be that a lot of people seem to have the view, maybe not in expressly philosophically formulated form, but the idea that they do have stronger obligations or more specific obligations to people that they know, family, friends, and so on, or in the animal case, than to complete strangers, especially people who are very distant to them. So if we appeal to people on the basis of objective moral obligations, then we can say, well, these obligations exist and we should act in accordance with them. Then maybe we can argue on that lines. But if we argue on the lines of sort of appealing to people's preferences about wanting to help, then they may not feel that sort of preference, that sort of desire to help people who sort of outside of their familiarity. So, there's not going to be a silver bullet there, right? But do you think that there's a way that we can appeal to people in that sort of situation?
I think there is. I'm reminded, for example, of the late Australian utilitarian philosopher Jack Smart, J.G.C. Smart, best known for a little book called Utilitarianism, For and Against, that he wrote the four-bit with Bernard Williams. And Jack Smart was certainly, I think the position in his day was known as emotivism, so somebody who thought there's no real objective moral facts, but that he nevertheless thought that you can try to persuade people to share this utilitarian view, and his view was that you should get them to really look at the suffering that they could relieve, or that perhaps they're even contributing to, let's say by buying factory farm products, or by being complicit in the exploitation of workers in developing countries, whatever else it might be, and look at that and say, do you really want to support that? Wouldn't you feel better if you knew that you were not supporting it, or if you were actually contributing to reducing it? And Jack's view was that most of us have a kind of benevolent emotion that is part of our nature, and that's a philosophical tradition, of course, that also goes back a long way. David Hume in the 18th century was a strong proponent of that idea about benevolent emotions and their role. So, yes, we could still do that. We could ask people to get more in touch with their feelings about this and to ask themselves if it isn't really disturbing to only focus on those that you have close relationships with and to ignore the rest. And I think you can probably make some progress, but maybe it's more limited than you could make if you can convince people that there are objective and impartial moral principles or ideals.
Yeah, well, partly that's why I asked previously whether you think that trying to stake out a particular meta-ethical viewpoint would be beneficial for effective altruism from that sort of perspective. Or is that just too much to try and take on board?
I think, I mean, I guess it depends, who's going to take it on board. I think it's good for philosophers to be discussing meta-ethics, some of them, and I think, if you're interested in and you have an interest in that kind of discussion, then by all means there's plenty to read. Have a look at it. But I don't think that everybody has to get into that kind of discussion, and I certainly don't think that you couldn't be a well-grounded, effective altruist without being in that discussion.
Right. So a slight shift in gears. I want to focus on a little bit on another really, well, I think quite prominent critique of effective altruism relating to the idea of justice. So certain people have argued that effective altruism basically ignores the idea of justice, that they talk about doing good, but they don't focus on like what type of good or who is the recipient of the good. And particularly there's often a criticism that people in Western nations and also their governments have particular obligations to redress past wrongs relating to slavery, colonialism and other things like that. And that this sort of historically based justice is just ignored by most EA accounts. So I might just read a brief quote here. This is from Easton Gabriel from Boston Review, and they said, effective altruists do not care about who benefits from intervention or in what way, only that the greatest total gain in well-being is achieved. This means they often overlook the weakest and most vulnerable members of the population who are frequently illiterate, victims of discrimination and consigned to geographically remote areas. Many of them also suffer from disabilities that place them out of reach of the welfare gains able-bodied people can achieve. Therefore, effective altruists tend to focus their efforts elsewhere. This approach leads to systematic neglect of those most in need, something that strikes many people as unjust. What do you think about criticisms like that?
I think the first part of that quote is right about an element of effective altruism, because effective altruism tends to look forward, tends to look towards the good you can do to make the world a better place. And perhaps this is going back a little bit into a more consequentialist view, but it would be prepared to say, look, some bad things have happened, but they're in the past. We can't really change them, but there are a lot of other things that we can do. And we could try, perhaps very hard, to compensate people for wrongs done to them, or, as is often discussed, to compensate the descendants of people for wrongs done to their ancestors. But if that is doing much less good in the sense of benefiting people than you could do with the same amount of resources elsewhere, then I think most effective altruists would say you ought to do good elsewhere. That's not necessarily the case, because if what we're talking about is doing good, you might say, well, my notion of good includes redressing wrongs or fixing righting injustices, and it's an injustice that the descendants of people who were wronged sometime in the past have not been compensated for the wrongs done to their ancestors. So you could still try to fit that in under effective altruism. But I think most effective altruists would probably not. They would probably say, yes, we do want to do the most good, and by that we mean benefit people or sentient beings the most, and therefore we are not going to be all that concerned about compensating people for wrongs done to their ancestors. But the quote that you read then moves from that to saying that effective altruists are likely to ignore the worse off. And I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think effective altruists very often point people to doing more to help the worst off than they would otherwise do. Now, why is that? Well, one reason for that is that when people are very badly off, your resources will go further in making them better off. Here's one way of looking at it. So suppose that you're someone who is really badly off by Australian standards, right? You're living in Australia, but you're poor by Australian standards. Let's say I actually don't. Does anyone know what's the poverty line in Australia for a family of four? Say, anybody got that figure in their head? I know in the United States it's about $22,000 US dollars. I don't know what it is in Australia, but let's say it's something similar, right? Okay, so suppose you had $1,000 that you could donate to help a family, and you gave it to that family. You wouldn't have made a life-changing difference to them. The difference between $22,000 and $23,000 is very far from a life-changing difference. Now suppose you looked beyond Australia's borders and you said, I want to give it to some of the poorest people in the world. Well, the World Bank tells us that they're earning less than $2 a day. So your $1,000 will be more than their annual income. You give more than someone's annual income to them, and it can be a life-changing difference. Because never before have they had the capital, let's say, to buy enough goods to start a small shop. They think they could make money with a shop. Or never before have they had the capital to replace their leaky thatched roof with a corrugated iron roof that not only will keep out the rain better and therefore stop their stores of grain from getting ruined, but doesn't need to be replaced every year, which costs something. So in the long run it saves them money, but they could never do it before. So that's why effective altruists will point people, particularly people living in affluent countries who have been thinking about donating within their own country, will point them to people who are much worse off than the people they were donating to. And I think that's a positive characteristic, but it's one because you're doing more good that way.
So I think I agree that most effective altruists, with respect to the earlier part of your comments, would be less interested in past injustices specifically and want to focus on what things now can do the most good. I guess the concern is, or at least from some people, that, in the extreme case, that seem to treat that as a reductio ad absurdum for effective altruism. If you're not putting redressing past injustices front and centre as among or the most important thing in your sort of social movement, then you're obviously doing something wrong. Not saying I agree with that or anything, but that seems to be the concern for at least some of these people. Do you think, what sort of responses do we have as a community to make to that sort of position?
Well, we're not going to be able to please everybody, that's true. And maybe some of these people we're not going to be able to please. But I think we ought to, somewhat on the lines of what I said Jack Smart would say, we ought to ask them to look at how much good you can do to people with the resources that otherwise would go to redressing these past wrongs, and look at how relatively less good they would do if they were given to redressing past wrongs, and ask yourself whether that makes a difference. And I think, many people, certainly for me, I can feel the emotional pull of redressing the wrong of somebody who has been wronged very recently, and they may want justice, they may want people who wronged them to be tried and convicted of a crime, and that's a very deep-seated emotion. Or they may want restitution of what was taken from them, or if that can't be done anymore, they may want compensation. And I guess we do feel that strongly. But in some of the cases that people are talking about, we might be talking about things that were done hundreds of years ago. And so we're talking about quite distant descendants. And then the questions really get quite complex, really. So are they actually worse off? I mean, this debate goes on about slavery and compensating African Americans for slavery. But are African Americans actually worse off today, living in the United States, than they would have been? And I put that in inverted commas because, of course, they simply wouldn't have existed. Their parents or grandparents would not have met if their ancestors had not been enslaved and they were still living in Liberia, let's say. But if we sort of hypothetically imagine them living in Liberia today, would they be better off? Well, they might say they're not subject to white racism, which still exists in the United States. But on the other hand, the standard of living is far better. I don't think many of them are queuing up to migrate back to Liberia, or back would be not quite the right word, but to migrate to Liberia. So, they're very complicated issues that you get into if you go down that road, and I think people who want to suggest that ought to be willing to discuss those issues and explain their position on them.
Yeah, undoubtedly that's when things get complicated, and maybe we'll just move slightly more in that complicated direction, which is what's called the sort of systematic change objection to effective altruism. So the idea here is that effective altruism doesn't focus enough, or sometimes at all, on structural or systematic changes that lie at the root causes of suffering, especially poverty and other things like that in the world. So another one of these quotes I might just throw in here. So Matthew Snowden, writing in Jacobin, said, "The irony of effective altruism is that it implores individuals to use their money to procure necessities for those who desperately need them, but says nothing about the system that determines how those necessities are produced and distributed in the first place." And end quote. And so that often goes along with the criticism that we in the industrialized West to sort of perpetuate a system of global capitalism that keeps people in a cycle of poverty, and that the sort of focus on philanthropy that is at the heart of EA kind of is not really addressing the root causes of that problem. And some of the strong criticisms actually argue that we're sort of maintaining that system in place by sort of making people feel better about themselves, that they're not doing anything to change it. So I know you've encountered this objection before, so what do you think about it?
Yeah, so I don't think it's true that effective altruism of its nature says nothing about the system that perpetuates poverty, assuming that there is such a system, just for the sake of the argument. As Vanessa said in her introduction, when I talk about effective altruism, I usually say it's a social movement and a philosophy, but she said it's a social movement and a philosophy and a field of research. And I think that's a really nice addition, because it certainly is a field of research and has increasingly become that in recent years. And one of the things that is researched is, are there ways, strategies for not just helping people in poverty now, but changing the system, if you like, for systematic change on a larger scale? And that's a big question. And if there are ways, what are they? And there's nothing in effective altruism that says we want to limit ourselves. Let's say, again, we're talking about people in extreme poverty. We want to limit ourselves to providing people in extreme poverty with what they need, whether it's food or healthcare or a bit of capital to set up a small business or whatever it is. And we don't want to try to find out whether there is a systematic change that would help not just a small number of people, but all of the people in extreme poverty. Everywhere in the world, perhaps that's extremely ambitious, or people in extreme poverty in particular countries, whatever. There's nothing in effective altruism that says we are not interested in that question. On the contrary, we are extremely interested in it, but I suppose we haven't yet been persuaded that there is a strategy for a very broad systematic change that would eliminate poverty worldwide. And that's what some of the people running the argument that you mentioned are thinking about. They're talking about, for example, abolishing global capitalism. Okay? Well, two important questions you need to ask somebody who says that. Firstly, what are you going to replace it with? What's the tried and proven system of economic productivity and distribution that does better than global capitalism? They may have an answer to that. The second question is, and how are you going to bring about the change to that superior system from where we are today? And I haven't heard anybody who's got any kind of plausible suggestions along those lines in the world today. So if you don't have good answers to both those questions, then it's a purely hypothetical possibility. Yes, if we could get rid of global capitalism and replace it with a different system under which nobody was in extreme poverty, of course we would be working towards doing that. But we're waiting for somebody to show us how that's possible. Now, there might be more local systematic changes that will help in various ways. And again, there's nothing in effective altruism that says we shouldn't do it. I'll give you one example that I think of as a systematic change. Mozambique has had a customary property law, according to which when a man died, a husband in a married couple died, the property of that couple went to the man's family. It did not go to the widow. So that meant that a couple might have farmed land together, might have saved together, for example, to buy land, might have farmed land together for 40 years. Then the husband dies, the land now belongs to the husband's family. They can evict the widow from the farm she's farmed for 40 years, if they like. Obviously, that's a system that contributes to impoverishment of women. So Oxfam a few years ago worked with civil society organisations in Mozambique to change that law, and the legislation was changed. That's a systematic change. It doesn't eliminate poverty outside Mozambique, it doesn't even eliminate poverty in Mozambique, but it systematically reduces the poverty of widows in Mozambique, and that's exactly the kind of thing that effective altruism, I think, should support. But of course, that Oxfam had a way of saying this could happen. They said there are these civil society groups in Mozambique, they're interested in this, but they don't have a lot of resources to run this campaign, so we can help them a little bit. If you give us those sorts of ideas and those sorts of strategies, then effective altruists will say, well, let's look at the probability of success, let's look at how much good success will do. And if what we then call the expected value, that is the value divided by the odds against achieving it, is high enough, then that will be a thing that effective altruists would support.
So at this point, I just want to remind everyone that we're inviting you to submit questions to the URL up there, which I will be hopefully asking Christina for just in a few moments. But before we get to some of those submitted by the audience, I just want to push back a little bit on the systematic change question and ask about, because it seems to me that people who are very concerned about this issue would make sort of two broad arguments. One is that the current system is horrifically unjust, and so even if we don't know exactly what we're going to replace it with, we have an ethical imperative to make significant moves in that direction towards getting rid of it, or at least significantly ameliorating the worst aspects. Although they usually argue that replacing it wholesale is what's necessary. But anyway, the second part is that they criticize the idea that we as effective altruism as a community have not been provided with a sufficiently persuasive alternative possibility, and therefore we're sort of not going to act on it. I think the criticism is that we're not really trying to find one. We're not really trying to engage in the sort of social and political activism, the sort that these people are typically interested in, and that by focusing on where private individuals can direct their donations, we're just sort of propping up the system as it is and not sort of exploring ways to change it systematically. And I think a related criticism is that the types of evidence that effective altruism demands, the most rigorous form is randomized controlled trials of interventions in the developing world, but other sorts of sort of quantitative evidence as well. These are obviously not really available for the sorts of systematic changes that these people are concerned about. And so I think the argument is that effective altruism sort of defines evidence in such a way, in such a narrow way, that there can't be evidence for, or sufficient evidence for systematic changes, and therefore effective altruism is sort of a blind to investigating those possibilities. So what would you say to this line?
Well, perhaps, we might say that at the outset, effective altruists were very enthusiastic about conducting randomised controlled trials. That seemed to be the gold standard of evidence. This is the same method that drug companies use, for example, to determine that a new drug is more effective than an existing treatment. And, you can do that with some interventions. You can do it, for example, with distributing bed nets. You get baseline measurements for infant or child mortality in many villages. You randomise, distribute bed nets in half of the villages, and then you look at the child mortality rates in those villages compared with the ones that got no bed nets. So very clearly prove the bed nets reduce child mortality, and you can even get a reasonable estimate of how much it costs per life saved. So, that seemed really nice evidence, and we could point to that and say, look, you'll do much more good giving to the Against Malaria Foundation, which has run these trials, than you would giving to other organisations where they don't do anything like that. But perhaps we did push that too hard for a while. I still think those are important methods in some cases, but it's true. I think we have to acknowledge that there are other interventions where you can't do randomised trials. And I just gave you an example. You can't run randomised trials of reforming the property laws in Mozambique, or even reforming property laws in general. There's not enough cases to give you statistically significant results, even if you could think that there were some similar ones. So, but I think the movement has actually gone beyond that. So one part of the movement now is something called Open Philanthropy, which is a project that is looking more widely than the sort of more traditional areas, if you like, if you can have a tradition when you're only 10 years old, of effective altruism, like extreme poverty. And, you know, one of those examples, just to, I think is relevant to what you were saying, James, was looking at a support for criminal justice reform in the United States. Now, you might say, well, why that? Why work in the United States? You know, surely you can do more good in poorer countries. But the idea was that there was pretty strong impetus for criminal justice reform from a lot of different circles, from progressives and people on the left who pointed out that it was mostly minorities who end up in prison for long periods and they don't get fair trials and so on, but also from conservatives who, realising how much of their taxes was going on huge criminal justice incarceration system in the United States. So the theory was that maybe it just needs a bit of a push here, a bit more organising. But that is an example of something where effective altruists might say, yes, we want to become activists and organise for this kind of cause, because actually the expected value, perhaps surprisingly, is quite high. So, there was another point that I didn't quite cover at the beginning that you made, and that is some people may say, well, the present system is just so unjust that it's really a kind of moral imperative to do something about it. And this may again go back to a point at which I and many, but perhaps not all, effective altruists are more consequentialist in their thinking, more oriented in trying to improving well-being. Because one of the things that people refer to when they talk about how unjust the system is they talk about inequality. A lot of people have been talking about the 1% and how much the 1% have as compared to the 99%. Or Oxfam, for example, which I praised a few moments ago, has had a campaign about how a handful of billionaires, I can't remember, it might have been 8 or something, own as much as 50% of the world. And you think, oh, how horrendous that is. But to me, that doesn't really tell me what I ought to do in terms of changing the system. Because let's suppose that I could, I don't think I can, but let's suppose that I could produce a system in which everybody had the same amount of income. But that income was the income that now the poorest people have, that $2 a day. Would that be a better world? You know, you might say it'd be a more just world. Obviously, it'd be a more equal world in terms of income. But I think it would be a much worse world. So what that shows is that for me, equality is not a dominant value. In fact, I don't even think of it as a value in itself. I think we want to work towards equality for the reasons I gave you before, because by helping the people who are worse off, you can generally do more good, use your resources more effectively. But is equality an intrinsic value, irrespective of whether you bring it about by bringing the poor up or by bringing the rich down? I don't think so.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point that I think people would, well, a lot of people clearly disagree about. But let's shift gears, and because I want to ask a bit about the long-term future. So we've talked a lot about doing good now and redressing injustices and helping people with poverty and so forth. But how does the sort of temporal aspect fit into this? In particular, I mean, a lot of, well, at least some people in the effective altruism movement are very concerned about reducing existential risks of extinction or significant damaging to the ecosphere, to humanity, and to life as a whole. So I mean, there's all sorts of questions that come up around this. One is sort of what time span should we be thinking about here? I mean, should we be thinking about years, decades, centuries, millions of years, as some people propose, where others say that that's an absurdly long period of time and we shouldn't be thinking about that. Another related question is, should we be concerned only about people who exist now and therefore who are potentially suffering now, or should our altruism also extend to people who don't exist, who may possibly exist in the future? And there's obviously a range of thorny philosophical problems about that. But what are your thoughts on these issues?
Yes, there are very thorny philosophical issues that get raised by those questions. The simpler one, I think, the less thorny one, is if you just say, should we be concerned about the future? And if so, to what extent? And I think the answer to that is clearly yes, we should be concerned about the future. So if, for example, we had some way, let's suppose we have nuclear waste and we have a way of storing it that will last 150 years, and let's say nobody alive now is going to be around in 150 years, but it's highly probable that there will be people around in 150 years, and because we can only store it safely for that long, so it's going to leak and they're going to die of radiation illness in 150 years. Is that a bad thing? Yes, I think somebody dying of radiation sickness in 150 years is just as bad as somebody alive right now dying of radiation sickness. But note that I've eliminated the uncertainty. I've eliminated the possibility that people in 100 years could repackage our waste so that it's safe, and various other uncertainties. So if there is no uncertainty, we should not discount the future at all, in my view. We should give it the same weight as the present. But because there is uncertainty, I think we are justified in paying it somewhat less attention, and the further out we get into the future, the greater the uncertainty, because we simply don't know what kind of capacities and abilities people will have then. We don't know how to benefit them with any degree of certainty in the far future. So I do think we discount for that reason. But there are a whole range of other questions that were raised by what you said. One is, would it be a bad thing if our species became extinct? And how bad a thing? So a lot of this discussion goes back to the Oxford philosopher Derek Hartman, who died just over a year ago, sadly. And he encourages us to think about this question in this way, thinking about how bad it would be if it became extinct. So imagine three possibilities, right? Possibility one is that there are no more wars and nothing that causes the extinction of our species, and we go on living peacefully for an indefinite future. Possibility two is that there is a large nuclear war that kills 99% of the population of the world, but 1% survive. And possibility three is that there is a large nuclear war that kills everyone. Now, the question is not, which of these possibilities do you think is worse? I think everybody would think extinction is worse, and everybody would think that the 99% is worse than peace continuing. Half of this question is, where do you think the bigger difference in value lies? In other words, is the gap between peace forever and 99% of the population being killed larger than the gap between 99% of the population being killed and 100%? Or is the gap between 99% and 100% total extinction larger than the gap between peace and 99%? Let's see what you think about that. How many do you think the gap between peace and 99% is a larger gap? Show of hands? Yes? Not very many hands going up. I don't know whether it's you're timid or don't know or whatever. Okay, how many do you think the gap between 99% and 100% is the larger gap? Well, a lot of you are saying that there's still more. I think there's a majority for that. Okay, so Parliament agrees with that. And probably I agree with that, though with less confidence maybe than some of the other judgments that I've made. The reason Parliament agrees with that, and a number of affected authors do, with the second view, is that they're thinking of all of the future generations who will exist, that 1% will come back and repopulate. Hopefully they'll learn from their mistakes. And then there's the hope, at least, of humans existing, not only on this planet perhaps, but colonising other planets eventually, for billions of years, maybe, pretty much indefinitely, and solving our problems, living happy lives, rich, fulfilling lives, winding back the frontiers of knowledge and all of the other things that you might think of. And because this will involve so many untold quintillions of people, or whatever is got on more zeros than that, that's a huge tragedy if that is lost by extinction, whereas the tragedy of the loss of the roughly 7 billion people in the 99% is a serious thing, of course, great tragedy, but not comparable to the other one. So, as I said, I probably agree with that, and therefore I think that if we can think of ways that reduce the risk of extinction of our species, that ought to have quite significant weight. That ought to be an important thing that we ought to do. Whether it completely outweighs the other things helping people here and now is a more difficult question to decide.
Well, let me ask just a little bit about that more difficult question then, because so the sort of argument that you refer to there, which is where people say something like, well, potentially humanity could be around for millions of years, a very long time, and there could be lots of people living good lives during that time, and we can do calculations and produce extremely large numbers. But the idea is that if humans went extinct, then all of those potentially good lives will be lost. And so that's an extremely large negative outcome. So if there are actions we can take now to reduce the risk of extinction, even if the chances of making any difference are extremely small, like we only reduce the probability by a tiny amount, doing the expected value calculation, weighing up the potential benefit, the argument goes that these sort of actions become extremely favourable. And some people say that they swamp all other possible actions that we could likely take, and therefore they take the lead as the most good that we can do. So there's that line of argument as to sort of one side of the question is what do you think of that line of argument, and the other side to the question is that some people are a bit concerned about that line of reasoning because it sounds a little bit like certain other arguments that have been made, including, for example, Pascal's wager, where he effectively said that, you should believe in God, because if you don't believe in God, then you die, well, you don't really lose anything. But if you do believe in God and God does exist, then you go to heaven. But if you don't believe in God and God does exist, then you go to hell, and that's an extremely bad outcome. So sort of weighing it up, you should believe in God. So some people think that these sort of far future arguments are a bit reminiscent of this sort of Pascal wager and other sorts of arguments like this, which they think are kind of dodgy, to use the philosophical term. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think these arguments about the future are actually better than Pascal's wager. And the problem with Pascal's wager is, maybe there is a God, and maybe the God will reward people for their intellectual integrity, and not believe things that they have other reasons to believe in. So I don't know why that should be less probable than the idea that there is a more traditional God who rewards those who believe in him because they want to go to heaven. But I think the argument about the importance of reducing existential risk is quite strong. And I'm happy that there are some people in the effective altruism movement working on that issue. Do I think that everybody in the effective altruism movement should work on that issue? Do I think that all the resources in the effective altruism movement should be devoted to that issue? No, I don't. And that's really because I'm not persuaded that we really know enough about how to do it. And so you might say, well, if we could just make it a little bit less probable still, that's what we should do. That depends on whether we really have a grip that we are making it less probable, that we're not just sort of stuffing things up. But also it does depend on another of the tricky philosophical questions that you raised in your previous question, and that is whether we give these very large numbers of future lives a weight that is comparable to the weight of people who exist now or who will exist irrespective of what we do, who we know are going to exist. Because some people will think, and this is again a significant philosophical argument, some people will think, look, if a person may not exist at all, then there isn't a loss caused by their non-existence in the same way that there is a loss when somebody who does exist dies prematurely or suffers when they needn't suffer. And one way of thinking that is by saying, well, they don't know what they're missing out on, whereas the others do know what they're missing out on, if you like. At least if you have some anticipation of your death, you know what you might miss out on, or if you're suffering, obviously you know what you're missing out on, believe it, for suffering. So there's this division in philosophy between people who take a view that's called the total view, which is simply you try to maximise the amount of utility in the universe timelessly, which would support the idea that all of these untold numbers of people who will exist if we don't go extinct count the same as people who exist now, and others who think that you are only ought to be concerned about people you affect, and you don't affect people if they don't come into your existence. And that's, I think, about as far as we could probably get with that difficult philosophical issue tonight.
Yeah, fair enough. So I'll then ask about, well, another slightly different difficult philosophical issue, which is the issue about how we should weight or compare the importance of we're doing good or helping people to live good, flourishing lives versus preventing or reducing suffering. So there are some people who think that suffering is just way more important than, above some certain baseline. Preventing or reducing suffering is way more important than increasing the pleasure or the well-being or whatever word you use of people's lives, and that may apply just now or in the future as well. So that can make a difference. For example, if we maybe place, if we would follow this argument, we might place extremely high weight on certain potential scenarios that would be very bad. Maybe just as a hypothetical example, certain climate scenarios which substantially reduce the living standards of those people on Earth. Maybe if we were particularly concerned about suffering, we might be very concerned about preventing these sorts of outcomes. So do you think what do you think of these sorts of positions? Do you think there's any reason for a sort of an asymmetry in how much we're concerned about suffering compared to well-being?
Yeah, I do think there's a reason for being more concerned about serious suffering than about well-being, not all forms of suffering. So I'm not a negative utilitarian. A negative utilitarian is someone who just says you want to prevent suffering. You don't care about whether you make people happy, you just don't want them to be suffering. I don't have that view. But I think there is a kind of, you might say, a natural asymmetry. And you may or may not agree with this, but one way of testing whether you do think there's a natural asymmetry is to think of some time period, let's say it's a day if you like, and suppose that you could have the best day that you've ever had in your life again, and it would be just as fresh and just as good as the best day that you ever had in your life. But in order to be granted that, you also have to have the worst day that you ever had in your life, the day with the most amount of suffering in it. If you've been fortunate and haven't suffered, then this doesn't apply to you, I guess. But if you have had a day where you were suffering a lot, you would have to have that again. And I think my view is, I wouldn't accept that. I wouldn't accept the worst day in my life in order to have the best day in my life. But I can see that some people might think differently. I think if you think about physical pain, I'm perhaps a bit clearer. The greatest physical pleasure, would I accept an hour of that, but I have to have an hour of the worst physical pain I've ever had? I think I'm pretty clear that I don't want that. But if you agree with me about those things, then you will think that there is just an asymmetry. It's not like the scale goes from 0, which is a sort of neutral state, whether you're neither suffering nor enjoying things, to plus 100 and minus 100. And if you agree that you wouldn't make those trade-offs, then maybe the scale goes from plus 100 through to the neutral state 0 to minus 500 or minus 1,000 or I don't know. So I think probably, yes, there is some point in saying we want to relieve suffering more than we want to create happiness.
Well, does that not potentially push us back in the other direction away from the far future? Because presumably, if people don't exist, then they're not suffering. Then we might think, well, if people don't exist in the future, that's not going to harm them. But there are people who are suffering along now, so we should not worry. We should worry a lot less about whether people exist in the future or extinction or anything like that. And we should really focus a lot on those who are suffering now.
Well, if we are negative utilitarians, yes, we should focus entirely on them. But if we're not negative utilitarians, then the numbers are going to make a difference. And if, as you said, the numbers are so vast, then unless your asymmetry scale is way more than the 1,000 versus 100, it's still going to say that we ought to be doing some things to improve the happiness of those in the future.
Yeah, so I think that, there's not really an answer to this, but I'm just curious as to what you would say. So in a lot of cases like that, you you have said tonight things about well, you know, it depends on your asymmetry scale or how you're weighing up, you know, suffering versus lives in the future, or how you're weighing up the value of justice versus you know, redressing past wrongs versus doing good and other things like that. And there's sort of this idea about you kind of have to weigh things up a bit and make a judgment call, and you know, there's not an exact hard and fast rule about it necessarily. I mean, I think that's, you know, it's sort of, it clearly is that way. But the question is, like, people disagree about how those judgments calls are made, and so what do we do about that? Do we just kind of say, well, they disagree and I think this and they think that? Like, is there any way of making progress again about these things, or like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's really hard to make progress on those things, and you know, maybe we will start to slowly make progress in some of these questions. But you know, I think that when somebody who disagrees with me, who I regard as having thought hard about this question, you know, perhaps has spent as much time on it as I have the same capacities to reflect on them as I have, then I think that's a reason why I should be less dogmatic about my own views. I should recognise that they may be right and I may be wrong, even though on balance I still think that I'm right. So, I think it, but I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. I'm open to further arguments and discussion.
Yeah, well, that's yeah. As I said, I don't think there's an easy solution to that. But hopefully, events like this are one forum where we can talk about different views about that and maybe make a little bit of progress. So I want to now move to the last couple of questions to close this out. First of all, I guess one question here is, what do you think is the most legitimate or most interesting or most valid philosophical criticism of effective altruism that we haven't talked about tonight?
I think you probably brought up all the interesting and valid philosophical criticisms of effective altruism. As I say, many of them have something going for them. Some of them are difficult. The questions about the way we give to the future is very difficult, especially when you're talking about beings who may not come into existence. Questions about whether our view of good is too focused on well-being and happiness and not enough on some of these other principles that people think are important is certainly another important question. And what we do about strategies that it's hard to get a handle on, how likely they are to succeed. I think that's a maybe more practical and philosophical question, but difficult. There's one more you didn't ask me, by the way, and that is, I've talked about trying to reduce the suffering of animals, but how do we rank that? Do we think that a chicken can suffer as much as a human? And if the answer to that is no, then how do we compare? We've got a finite amount of resources. Let's say we give it to Against Malaria Foundation, and it will save the lives of 10 children who would have otherwise died of malaria and cause their parents great grief and loss and so on. Or let's say we give it to Animals Australia and it helps them to win the campaign against the live export trade, and so there are millions of sheep who no longer get exported to the Middle East and die in terrible ways. But someone might say, yes, but suffering of a sheep isn't comparable to the suffering of a child who's ill or the parents of the child. So, what numbers would be necessary for us to say it's better to stop the live export trade than to donate the resources to the Against Malaria Foundation? And that's, again, a very difficult question.
Do you think there's actually a right answer to that question?
On that one, I think there is a right answer. We just don't know it. We don't have a way of getting to know it because we don't really know what it's like to be a sheep going through what the sheep go through on these voyages.
Yeah, that's a particularly interesting one. I think about how you weigh different types of animals, and sheep are arguably at the easier end of the spectrum when you start to about invertebrates and other things like that. Sure. But maybe we'll have a whole other evening to talk about those questions. So one last question is, so many people in effective altruism are concerned about looking for new areas of research or of activism that people aren't really working on or haven't really thought about much yet. The idea here is that in the past there have been sort of moral blind spots that people at the day rarely, if ever, saw, like the injustice of slavery or gender discrimination and things like that. They were just almost not at all talked about until people started raising them. So the question is, what, if any, things do you think might be candidates for this sort of mythical cause X, that is a cause that we haven't thought about yet, but is sort of a moral issue that our descendants will think, well, why didn't they talk about it at that time? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Not much, because if I didn't know what cause X would be, I would have been talking about it already. So, you know, I've looked at issues that I think have been unduly neglected. I think the treatment of animals was unduly neglected when I started talking about it in the 1970s. It wasn't completely neglected, but it wasn't seen as a big moral issue. It was seen as a kind of sentimental thing for the proverbial old ladies in tennis shoes. I don't wish to insult women who are of a certain age and wear tennis shoes. They've been done many good things, including being obviously in the man-yard on this issue of treatment of animals. You know, that's one. I think that, you know, there are a range of other questions that we need. Clearly, climate change is a new issue that we didn't even really know about for a while, and it's taken a while to gather steam, but we do all know about that now. But no, I can't predict what the next thing to emerge will be, sorry.
All right, well, that's all the questions. Well, I've got more questions, but I think we're running low on time, so I'll pass it back to Vanessa at this point. And just thank you for your time.
So thank you very much to Professor Singer and to James for that really interesting and insightful discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it and hope you learned something new as well. Thank you also to everyone who submitted questions. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to them all. Happily, Professor Singer will be out in the lobby for a little while, so maybe some of you will get to ask then. And finally, thank you very much to everybody who spent time organising the event, especially Adam Ford for filming and to Matt Weissman for taking over the running of this event. So if you'd like to learn more about effective altruism, then as it says on the screen, effectivealtruism.org is a good place to start. And another interesting organisation is 80,000 Hours. They do high-quality research on which careers are the most impactful and how you can sort of get involved in those careers. So particularly if you're a student, that's a really interesting organisation to have a look at. If you're interested in coming to more Effective Altruism Melbourne events, check us out on Facebook and Meetup. All our event details get posted there. Our next special event will be another opportunity to hear from James, who facilitated tonight. He'll be talking about measurement problems in economic development. So maybe slightly more practical side of effective altruism will be covered at that event. We also run monthly discussion groups on the second Saturday of every month, monthly co-working days on the third Sunday of every month, and fortnightly social events. There's always a lot of interesting discussion at these events, so if you'd like to talk more about effective altruism, please do come along. All the details are up here, obviously, and also on the little flyers that you should have been handed when you came in. Hopefully. So we're also looking for new people to help out with running the Effective Altruism Melbourne group. So if that's something that you might be interested in, please come and talk to me or anyone wearing an Effective Altruism t-shirt, or you can also email us or contact us on Facebook or Meetup. Finally, if you'd like to join up to be an official member of Effective Altruism Melbourne, that sort of allows you to vote in elections and also run key positions on the committee, then you can do that out on the laptops in the lobby as well. I know it's been covered a couple of times, but I just want to mention the Life You Can Save Melbourne, which, as was mentioned, is a group that's focused on encouraging people to give more and give more effectively to poverty alleviation organisations. So they meet monthly, generally on the first Sunday of every month, not always, and they also do sort of outreach activities and public speaking at school groups and other community groups to try and promote these ideas around effective giving. So I'm sure they'd really love to speak to you. They'll be out in the lobby by their banner, which you should see as you come out of the theatre here. So please go and say hi. Just a couple more things. I just want to mention the EAGX Australia conference, which is happening in July in Melbourne here. So this is the annual Australian Effective Altruism Conference, and it's always a really great opportunity to learn more and get really involved in the effective altruism community. So the theme that's been chosen for this year is Stay Curious, which is to encourage us to sort of keep an open mind about how we can do the most good. So some of the questions and sort of issues that were explored here tonight, as well as other sort of more practical issues, will be explored at this conference. There'll be a Friday night keynote with Professor Singer again, and then there'll be 2 days of workshops, talks, and panel discussions about issues related to effective altruism. Please do come along if you're free. You can get your tickets at eagxaustralia.com. Okay, this is the last thing. There we are. So I would really love if you could submit some feedback for tonight's event. This will sort of help us to improve our future events, so we'd really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes. So before you get up from your seats, please just sit there for a couple of minutes, fill in the feedback form. It shouldn't take long, and it will be a great help to us. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the evening, and as I said before, there'll be refreshments out in the foyer, so please join us for that. Thank you very much.